The morning sunlight filtered through the crystal formations that dotted the landscape of Haven's Rest, casting rainbow patterns across the peaceful valley where humans and Lumari had lived together for 3 generations. Tommy Brooks kicked a small pebble as he walked to school, humming a song his Lumari friend Vel had taught him the day before. The melody was simple but beautiful, and the bioluminescent patterns that danced across Vel's translucent skin when he sang made the music even more magical. Haven's Rest was everything humanity had dreamed of when they first reached for the stars. The colony stretched across rolling hills covered in silver grass that moved like waves in the gentle breeze. Crystal formations jutted from the ground like frozen lightning, providing the clean energy that powered their cities. The Lumari had shown them how to harvest this energy without harming the delicate ecosystem, sharing their knowledge freely because they believed in the beauty of cooperation. In the colony's central plaza, Maria Santos watched her daughter play with a group of young Lumari. The alien children moved with fluid grace, their skin shifting from soft blue to warm gold as they laughed and chased each other around the fountain. These were the 3rd generation of human children to grow up alongside the Lumari, and they spoke both languages fluently. They understood that the different colored lights on their friend's skin meant different emotions and thoughts. To them, this was simply normal life. The Lumari had no concept of violence or war. Their entire civilization was built on harmony and understanding. When they first met the human colonists, they had been curious about these new beings who seemed so different yet so eager to learn. The humans brought technology and agriculture, while the Lumari shared their deep connection to the planet's natural rhythms. Together, they had created something beautiful. David Kim finished his shift at the energy harvesting facility and headed home to his family. The work was easy and fulfilling, nothing like the dangerous mining operations on other worlds. The Lumari had taught them to listen to the crystals, to understand when they were ready to give their energy and when they needed to rest. It was a gentler way of living, one that many humans had never experienced before coming to Haven's Rest. The colony's leader, Governor Anna Walsh, stood in her office reviewing the monthly reports. Food production was up by 12%. The new residential area was ahead of schedule. The Lumari elders had agreed to share more of their agricultural techniques with the human farmers. Everything was proceeding perfectly. She smiled as she looked out her window at the mixed groups of humans and Lumari working together in the gardens below. In the communication center, Operator Phil Morrison received the routine check-in request from Terran Command. These calls happened every few days, just a simple confirmation that everything was running smoothly. He activated the transmitter and began the standard report when something caught his eye in the sky. A shadow was moving across the sun, too. Large and too regular to be a cloud. The Vorthek fleet materialized in the atmosphere without warning. Their ships were massive, dark metallic constructs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The peaceful morning was shattered by the roar of engines and the crackling of energy weapons charging. The colonists looked up in confusion and growing fear as the alien vessels positioned themselves above their cities. Governor Walsh rushed to the communication center as emergency. Alarms began to sound throughout the colony. She had never seen ships like these before. They were nothing like the sleek, elegant vessels that occasionally visited from other human colonies. These ships radiated menace and power, their weapon arrays clearly visible even from the ground. The transmission from the laid Vorthek ship was cold and mechanical. The voice that spoke was translated by the colony's computers, but the tone needed no translation. It was the voice of absolute authority, the voice of conquerors who had never been denied. They identified themselves as the Vorthek Empire and declared that Haven's Rest was now under their control. All inhabitants had 6 hours to evacuate the planet or face the consequences. Maria Santos gathered her family in their home as the announcement echoed through the colony's communication system. Her husband, Roberto, tried to remain calm as he explained to their children that they might need to leave their home quickly. The little girl asked why the new visitors sounded so angry. Roberto had no answer for her. The Lumari elders emerged from their sacred groves with expressions of deep sadness and confusion. They had felt the arrival of the Vorthic ships as a disturbance in the planet's natural harmony. These beings radiated something they had never encountered before, something dark and violent that made their sensitive minds recoil in pain. They gathered in the central plaza, their skin flickering with patterns that spoke of fear and uncertainty. Governor Walsh attempted to open negotiations with the Vorthic commander. She explained that Haven's Rest was a peaceful colony with no military significance. The humans and Lumari posed no threat to anyone. Surely there was some misunderstanding that could be resolved through dialogue. The Vorthic response was swift and brutal. They were not interested in negotiations. They wanted the planet, and they would take it with or without the inhabitants' cooperation. The evacuation began immediately, but it was chaos. The colonists had never prepared for anything like this. Their ships were designed for cargo and passenger transport, not emergency evacuation. There were not enough vessels to carry everyone, and the ones they had would need multiple trips. The Lumari, with their deep connection to the planet, were reluctant to leave their sacred groves. They had lived here for thousands of years, and their entire culture was tied to this world. Tommy Brooks found his friend Vel in the confusion of the evacuation. The young Lumari's skin was flickering rapidly through different colors, a sign of extreme distress. Vel explained that his people could not simply leave their world. Their life force was connected to the crystal formations and the sacred groves. To leave would be like asking a human to leave their heart behind. As the deadline approached, it became clear that the evacuation was impossible. There were too many people and not enough time. The Vorthic had given them 6 hours, knowing it could not be done. They wanted the colonists to fail, to give them an excuse for what came next. Governor Walsh made one final plea to the Vorthic commander, asking for more time to relocate the children and elderly first. The response came in the form of weapons fire. The first blast struck the colony's main power station, sending a column of fire and smoke into the sky. The message was clear. There would be no extension, no mercy, no negotiation. The Vorthic had decided that the inhabitants of Haven's Rest were expendable, and they would demonstrate the cost of defying their will. In those final moments, as the orbital bombardment began, the true nature of both species was revealed. The humans rushed to protect their children and their Lumari friends. The Lumari, despite their fear, used their bodies to shield the human families around them. Their final bioluminescent patterns spelled out messages of love and protection even as the sky burned above them. The war room aboard the Vorthic flagship was filled with the sounds of victory. Officers moved between tactical displays showing the complete destruction of Haven's Rest, their chittering voices expressing satisfaction with the operation's success. The planet's surface still glowed with the heat of orbital bombardment, and the energy readings showed no signs of life remaining in any of the former settlements. High Admiral Krex reviewed the battle reports with cold efficiency. The human colony had been eliminated in less than 4 hours, and the primitive Lumari had been swept away along with them. The operation had proceeded exactly as planned, demonstrating once again the superiority of Vorthic military doctrine. Fear was the most effective weapon in their arsenal, and today's display would spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. The Vorthic Empire had built its power on the foundation of overwhelming force. Their massive fleets moved through space, like a plague of metal locusts, consuming everything in their path. They had conquered 47 star systems by showing potential enemies what happened to those who resisted. Most species surrendered after witnessing the fate of the first few worlds that had dared to oppose them. War. Commander Thex activated the holographic display showing the Empire's expansion plans. Haven's Rest had been marked as a strategic location for their next phase of conquest. The planet's energy resources and position along major shipping routes made it valuable, but its inhabitants had been irrelevant. The Vorthic had learned long ago that it was easier to take what they wanted than to negotiate for it. The destruction of Haven's Rest was being transmitted to every corner of the galaxy through the Vorthic's propaganda networks. And the message was, Simple and clear, this was what happened to those who occupied territory that the Empire desired. The images of burning cities and shattered crystal formations would serve as a warning to other species who might consider standing in their way. In the depths of the flagship, captured data from the colony's computers was being analyzed by Vorthak intelligence officers. The humans had kept detailed records of their interactions with the Lumari, and these files revealed the extent of cooperation between the two species. The Vorthak found this information useful for understanding their enemies' weaknesses, but they dismissed it as evidence of primitive thinking. The Lumari's telepathic abilities had been noted in the intelligence reports, but the Vorthak had not considered them a significant threat. Their own minds were shielded by cybernetic implants that protected them from psychic intrusion. The peaceful nature of the Lumari made them unsuitable for warfare, and their destruction had been a simple matter of overwhelming firepower, Captain. Vex led the ground assault teams that had swept through the colony's remaining structures after the orbital bombardment. His soldiers had found evidence of the humans' attempts to protect the Lumari civilians, but these gestures had been futile. The Vorthak war machine was designed to crush all resistance, and the primitive emotions of their enemies only made them easier to defeat. The tactical analysis showed that the humans had no effective military response to Vorthak weapons technology. Their ships were designed for exploration and commerce, not warfare. Their colonies were defended by small security forces that had never faced a real military threat. The conquest of human space would be a simple matter of methodical destruction. World by world. High Admiral Krex transmitted his report to the Vorthak High Command, detailing the successful elimination of Haven's Rest and recommending the immediate implementation of the next phase of expansion. The human colonies in the surrounding systems would be given the same choice: surrender or face destruction. Based on the intelligence gathered from Haven's Rest, he expected most of them to submit without resistance. The Vorthak's understanding of human psychology was based on their observations of other species they had conquered. They had learned that most civilizations would sacrifice anything to preserve their lives, even their freedom and dignity. The humans appeared to be no different, despite their apparent attachment to the primitive Lumari. Fear was universal, and the Vorthak had mastered its application. What the Vorthak failed to understand was that humans were unlike any species they had encountered before. While most galactic civilizations had evolved beyond what they considered primitive emotional responses, humanity had retained something that made them unique among the stars. They had kept their capacity for righteous anger, their instinct to protect the innocent, and their absolute refusal to accept injustice. The news of Haven's Rest reached Earth through a damaged transport vessel that had escaped the initial bombardment. The survivors were badly injured and traumatized, but they carried with them the complete records of the Vorthak attack. The footage they had captured showed the systematic nature of the destruction, the deliberate targeting of civilian areas, and the Vorthak's obvious enjoyment of the slaughter. Dr. James Wright, the Terran Assembly's leading xenopsychologist, analyzed the intelligence reports with growing horror. The Vorthak had not simply conquered a territory. They had committed genocide for the purpose of intimidation. The attack on Haven's Rest was designed to terrorize other species into submission. Using the deaths of innocent colonists as a weapon of war, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session to address the Haven's Rest incident. Representatives from dozens of species condemned the Vorthak's actions and called for economic sanctions. The debate continued for hours as diplomats searched for a peaceful solution to the crisis. The Vorthak ambassador listened to the proceedings with obvious contempt, making it clear that his empire would not be deterred by words. While the council debated, the human survivors of Haven's Rest were giving their testimony to Terran military intelligence. They described watching their neighbors die in the bombardment, seeing families torn apart by the Vorthak's weapons, and witnessing the Lumari's desperate attempts to protect human children with their own bodies. The accounts painted a picture of deliberate cruelty that went far beyond military necessity. The Vorthak had made their greatest miscalculation in believing that humans would respond like other species. They expected fear, submission, and acceptance of their superior power. Instead, They had awakened something that had been dormant in humanity for generations. The news of Haven's Rest spread through human space like a wildfire, igniting a fury that surprised even the humans themselves. On colonies throughout Terran space, civilians gathered around communication screens to watch the memorial services for the victims of Haven's Rest, the images of the destroyed settlements and the testimonies of the survivors created a wave of emotion that transcended political boundaries. Workers stopped their jobs to observe moments of silence. Students organized vigils for the dead. Veterans came out of retirement to volunteer for military service. The Vorthak watched these human reactions with confusion and dismissal. They interpreted the emotional displays as evidence of weakness and primitive thinking. In their experience, species that allowed emotion to guide their decisions were easy to defeat. They had never encountered a civilization that could channel its anger into focused, determined action. The transformation of human space was swift and total. The Terran Defense Force, which had been primarily focused on exploration and colony protection, found itself overwhelmed with volunteers. Recruitment centers that had been quiet for years suddenly had lines of applicants stretching around city blocks. The memory of Haven's Rest had awakened something in humanity that the Vorthak had never seen before. High Admiral Krex received reports of increased human military activity but dismissed them as the predictable response of a species in denial. The humans would make a few gestures of defiance, perhaps even attempt some minor retaliation, but they would ultimately submit to superior force. The Vorthak had seen this pattern dozens of times before, and the outcome was always the same. The Vorthak began preparations for the next phase of their expansion, confident that the lesson of Haven's Rest had been learned by all who might oppose them. They moved their fleets into position to strike at the next targets on their list, unaware that they had made a fatal error in their calculations. They had assumed that the murder of innocents would break human resistance, but instead they had created an enemy unlike any they had ever faced. The assembly hall in the Terran capital was packed beyond capacity as representatives from every human colony gathered for an emergency session. The air was thick with tension and barely contained rage as the survivors of Haven's Rest finished their testimony. Barbara Chun, one of the few who had escaped the bombardment, stood at the podium with tears streaming down her face as she described watching her Lumari friend die while trying to protect her children. President Sarah Martinez had seen many crises during her time in office, but nothing had prepared her for the wave of emotion that swept through human space following the Haven's Rest massacre. The usual political divisions had vanished overnight, replaced by a unity of purpose that transcended party lines and colonial boundaries. The attack had awakened something primal in the human psyche, something that demanded justice for the innocent. Dead. In research facilities across human space, scientists were analyzing every piece of data recovered from Haven's Rest. Dr. Emily Watson led the xenobiology team studying the Vorthak's methods, looking for weaknesses in their technology and tactics. The enemy had made their attack with overwhelming force, but their approach revealed patterns that could be exploited. The Vorthak relied on fear and intimidation, but they had never faced an enemy that refused to be intimidated. The memorial service for the victims of Haven's Rest was broadcast to every human colony simultaneously. Millions of people watched. As the names of the dead were read aloud, each one representing a life cut short by Vorthak cruelty, the list included humans and Lumari alike, children and adults, farmers and teachers, all of them innocent victims of a war they had never asked for. Admiral Patricia Stone stood before the assembled fleet commanders at the Terran Defense Force headquarters. The room was filled with officers who had dedicated their careers to protecting human colonies from pirates and natural disasters. None of them had ever faced an enemy like the Vorthak, but the determination in their eyes showed that they were ready to learn. The attack on Haven's Rest had transformed the TDF from a peacekeeping force into something much more dangerous. The industrial capacity of human space underwent a dramatic transformation as civilian factories retooled for military production. Shipyards that had been building cargo vessels and passenger transports began constructing warships. Mining operations increased their output to provide raw materials for the war effort. The entire human economy reorganized itself around a single goal, building the tools needed to make the Vorthek pay for their crimes. In the outer colonies, volunteer militias began forming spontaneously as colonists prepared to defend their homes. Former soldiers came out of retirement to train civilians in combat techniques. Farmers learned to use their agricultural equipment as weapons. Teachers organized evacuation drills for their students. The memory of Haven's Rest had shown them what would happen if they failed to resist. The Vorthek Intelligence Network reported the increased human military activity to High Command, but the reports were dismissed as the desperate actions of a weak species. The Vorthak had seen similar responses from other civilizations they had conquered, and the outcome was always the same. The humans would exhaust themselves in futile preparation for a war they could not win. Captain Michael Rodriguez commanded the first new warship to come off the production lines. The vessel was unlike anything in the previous TDF fleet, designed specifically for fighting the Vorthak. Its armor was based on analysis of the enemy's weapons. Its shields were tuned to deflect their energy signatures, and its weapons were calibrated to penetrate their defenses. The ship represented humanity's determination to fight back with everything they had. The recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers from every walk of life. Engineers volunteered to design new weapon systems. Pilots applied for positions in the expanding fleet. Marines signed up for the dangerous job of boarding enemy vessels. The diversity of volunteers showed that the response to Haven's Rest had transcended all social boundaries, uniting humanity in a way that had never been seen before. Dr. Watson's research team made a breakthrough when they discovered the psychological profile of the Vorthak species. The aliens had evolved as predators on a harsh world where only the strongest survived. Their entire civilization was built on the principle of dominance through force, and they had never encountered a species that could match their capacity for violence. The humans were about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The Terran Assembly voted unanimously to authorize the formation of a new military branch dedicated to hunting down the Vorthek. The Special Operations Command would be responsible for striking at enemy targets throughout the galaxy using tactics that the Vorthek had never encountered. The memory of Haven's Rest would drive them to places the enemy thought were safe. In the ruins of Haven's Rest, a small team of human investigators worked to recover the remains of the victims. The planet's surface was still scarred by the orbital bombardment, but they found evidence of the final moments of the colony. The Lumari had died protecting their human friends, and the humans had died trying to save the Lumari. The bonds between the two species had been stronger than death itself. The Vorthak prepared for their next assault, confident that the humans would crumble under the weight of superior firepower. They had selected 3 more colonies for destruction, planning to eliminate human resistance through a campaign of systematic terror. The intelligence report showed increased military activity, but the Vorthak believed their own propaganda about human weakness. Admiral Stone reviewed the battle plans that had been developed by the Combined Human Military Command. The strategy was unlike anything that had ever been attempted, based on the premise that the Vorthak's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. The enemy relied on overwhelming force and predictable tactics, but humans had learned to fight dirty when necessary. The gloves were coming off. The first human strike force launched from the secret base at Alpha Centauri under the command of Captain Lisa Park. Her mission was to test the new weapons and tactics against a minor Vorthak outpost, gathering intelligence for the larger campaign to come. The crew of her ship had volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide mission, but they carried with them the memory of Haven's Rest and the determination to make the enemy pay. The transformation of human space was complete. A species that had been known for its peaceful exploration and cooperative spirit had become something else entirely. The Vorthak had awakened a sleeping giant, and they were about to learn why humanity had survived every challenge their harsh homeworld had thrown at them. The hunt was about to begin. The children of Haven's Rest would never grow up to see the stars, but their memory would light the way for the warriors who would avenge them. The Lumari songs of peace had been silenced forever, but their sacrifice would be remembered in the battle hymns of the human fleet. The Vorthak had wanted to teach the galaxy a lesson about their power, but they were about to learn a lesson about the consequences of murdering innocents. The war councils met in secret locations throughout human space, planning operations that would strike at the heart of the Vorthak Empire. The enemy had shown no mercy to the civilians of Haven's Rest, and they would receive no mercy in return. The humans had learned that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to wage war with absolute determination. The memorial flames burned continuously in the centers of human cities, reminding everyone of what had been lost and what needed to be avenged. The faces of the dead looked down from countless monuments, their eyes holding the promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The Vorthak had created these martyrs, and now they would face the consequences of their cruelty. The silence in space was broken by the sudden appearance of 12 human warships as they dropped out of hyperspace near the Vorthak supply depot at Kepler Station. Commander Tom Bradley watched the enemy installation through his ship's viewscreen, noting the massive defensive platforms that surrounded the facility. The Vorthak had built this outpost to be impregnable, but they had never faced human ingenuity driven by righteous fury. The supply depot was a critical link in the Vorthak supply chain, providing fuel and ammunition to their forward fleets. Intelligence. Reports indicated that over 10,000 enemy personnel were stationed at the facility, along with enough military hardware to equip an entire invasion force. The destruction of this base would deal a significant blow to the Vorthak war machine, but more importantly, it would announce to the galaxy that humanity was no longer hiding behind defensive lines. Ken Lisa Park commanded the lead assault ship, a vessel that had been designed specifically for this type of operation. Her crew had trained for months in scenarios that replicated the conditions they would face in enemy territory. They had studied every detail of Vorthak defensive systems, learning to exploit weaknesses that the enemy had never bothered to protect. The memories of Haven's Rest burned in their minds as they prepared for battle. The human attack began with a coordinated strike against the depot's communication systems. Specialized warheads designed to disrupt Vorthak electronics detonated throughout the facility, cutting off the garrison's ability to call for reinforcements. The enemy's overconfidence had made them predictable, and the humans had learned to turn that predictability into a weapon. The Vorthak defense platforms opened fire as soon as they detected the human ships, but their weapons were designed to fight enemies who followed conventional tactics. The human vessels moved in patterns that defied standard military doctrine, using their superior maneuverability to avoid the heavy weapons while closing to effective range. The enemy's massive guns could not track targets that refused to behave. Like proper military formations, Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos led the boarding parties that breached the depot's hull after the main defenses were neutralized. Her Marines had been trained in close-quarters combat against Vorthak warriors, learning to exploit the enemy's reliance on cybernetic enhancements. The aliens were stronger and faster than humans, but they had become dependent on their technology in ways that could be turned against them. The battle inside the depot was vicious and personal. The human Marines remembered the images from Haven's Rest as they fought their way through the corridors, seeing in every Vorthak warrior a potential participant in the massacre. There were no prisoners taken, no quarter given. The enemy had shown no mercy to the civilians of Haven's Rest, and they would receive none in return. The Vorthak garrison commander tried to organize a defense, but his forces were unprepared for the ferocity of the human assault. His warriors had been trained to fight enemies who would break under pressure, not opponents who seemed to grow stronger as the battle intensified. The humans fought with a desperation that bordered on madness, driven by memories of murdered children and slaughtered innocents. Captain Park's ship targeted the depot's main reactor while the boarding parties secured the facility's data cores. The intelligence gathered from this operation would be invaluable for planning future attacks. But the real message was simpler. The Vorthak were no longer safe anywhere in the galaxy. The humans had learned to hunt, and they would not stop until Every war criminal had been brought to justice. The explosion that destroyed Kepler Station could be seen from 3 star systems away. The facility that had been considered impregnable was reduced to expanding plasma and debris in less than 4 hours. More importantly, the human strike force had suffered minimal casualties, proving that the new tactics and weapons were effective against Vorthak defenses. News of the attack spread through the Vorthak Empire like wildfire, causing panic among the military leadership. The humans had struck at a target that was supposed to be beyond their reach, using weapons and tactics that had not appeared in any intelligence reports. The primitive species that had been dismissed as weak and emotional had revealed capabilities that threatened the Empire's entire strategic position. High Admiral Krex reviewed the reports from Kepler Station with growing concern. The humans had not simply destroyed a military facility. They had done it with a precision and ruthlessness that suggested a fundamental change in their approach to warfare. The species that had pleaded for mercy at Haven's Rest had become something else entirely, something that posed a real threat to Vorthak supremacy. The human strike forces began hitting targets throughout Vorthak space with increasing frequency and effectiveness. Supply convoys disappeared without trace. Communication relays were destroyed by sabotage. Forward bases were abandoned after their garrisons were found dead at their posts. The Empire's expansion had ground to a halt as resources were diverted. To defend against the human threat, Captain Rodriguez commanded the second wave of attacks, targeting the industrial facilities that supported the Vorthak war machine. His ships struck at mining operations, manufacturing plants, and research stations with surgical precision. The enemy's economy began to suffer as production dropped and supply lines were disrupted. The humans had learned that victory required more than just military action. The Vorthak attempted to negotiate after losing a dozen major installations to human raids. Their ambassadors approached the Galactic Council with offers of territorial concessions and reparations for the Haven's Rest incident. The human response was swift and uncompromising. There would be no negotiations with genocidal murderers. The only acceptable outcome was the complete surrender of all personnel involved in the massacre. General Marcus Cole led the ground assault on the Vorthak fortress world of Rigel Prime. The planet had been considered unconquerable, protected by Olgatil defense platforms and garrisoned by the Empire's elite forces. The human landing was a masterpiece of military planning, using multiple simultaneous assaults to overwhelm the defenders and establish secure beachheads on the planet's surface. The battle for Rigel Prime lasted 3 days and demonstrated the full extent of humanity's transformation. The Marines who stormed the fortress walls were no longer the peacekeeping force that had once protected colonies from pirates. They were warriors forged in the fires of righteous anger, tempered by the memory of innocent dead, and sharpened by months of constant combat. Against a merciless enemy, the Vorthak defenders fought with the desperation of cornered predators. But they were facing an enemy that had evolved beyond their understanding. The humans had learned to match their savagery while maintaining the tactical discipline that made them effective. The combination of controlled fury and military precision proved unstoppable against defenders who had grown complacent in their superiority. The fortress's data cores revealed the true scope of the Vorthak's plans for human space. Haven's Rest had been only the beginning of a campaign designed to eliminate humanity entirely. The discovery of these documents eliminated any remaining doubt about the righteousness of the human response. The Vorthak had planned genocide, and they would face the consequences of their intentions. The fall of Rigel Prime sent shockwaves through the Vorthak Empire. The planet that had been the cornerstone of their defensive strategy was now in human hands, its garrison eliminated and its secrets exposed. The myth of Vorthak invincibility had been shattered, and their enemies throughout the galaxy began to sense weakness in the empire that had once seemed unstoppable. Admiral Stone reviewed the strategic situation from her command center on the captured world. The human forces had accomplished more in 6 months than anyone had thought possible, but the real war was just beginning. The Vorthak would not surrender easily, and the path to their capital world would be paved with the wreckage of both fleets. The memory of Haven's Rest would sustain them through the battles to come. The transformation of humanity was complete. The species that had once sought peaceful coexistence with their neighbors had become the galaxy's most effective military force. The Vorthek had awakened something that they could not control, and now they would face the full fury of a people who refused to forgive the murder of innocents. The hunt would continue until justice was served. The tactical displays in the Vorthak High Command showed a galaxy in flames as another fleet vanished from the strategic map. High Admiral Krex stared at the holographic projection of his crumbling empire, watching red markers disappear one by one as human forces systematically dismantled everything the Vorthak had built over centuries of conquest. The species he had dismissed as primitive and weak had become the most effective military force the galaxy had ever seen, the Vorthak military. Commanders gathered in the war room were arguing among themselves, their voices rising in panic as reports continued to arrive from across the Empire. Fortress worlds that had never been threatened were falling to human assault forces. Supply lines that had operated safely for decades were being cut by human raiders. The very foundations of their civilization were crumbling under the relentless pressure of humanity's campaign of justice. War Commander Thex activated the latest intelligence reports, showing the human fleet's approach to the Imperial capital. The enemy force consisted of over 200 warships, representing the combined might of every human colony and military installation in the galaxy. They had come not as conquerors seeking territory, but as instruments of justice seeking to end the threat of Vorthak aggression forever. The attempts at negotiation had failed completely. The Vorthak had offered territorial concessions, reparations, and even the surrender of the officers responsible for the Haven's Rest massacre. The human response had been the same every time. There would be no negotiations with genocidal murderers. The only acceptable outcome was the complete dismantling of the Vorthak Empire and the prosecution of all personnel involved in war crimes. Admiral Patricia Stone stood on the bridge of the TDF, Vengeance, as the massive human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Vorthak home system. The flagship was a monument to human engineering and determination, its hull scarred by dozens of battles but its weapon systems functioning perfectly. The crew around her represented the best of humanity, volunteers who had dedicated their lives to ensuring that no other species would suffer the fate of Haven's Rest. The Vorthak capital world was protected by the most powerful defensive network in the galaxy. Orbital platforms bristled with weapons that could destroy entire fleets. The planet's surface was covered with military installations manned by the Empire's most elite warriors. The system's outer defenses included minefields, automated weapons, platforms, and patrol fleets that had never been defeated in battle. Captain Lisa Park commanded the advanced strike force that began the assault on the outer defenses. Her ships moved through the minefield like dancers, their crews using tactics that had been perfected through months of constant combat. The Vorthak mines were powerful, but they were designed to destroy ships that followed predictable flight paths. The human vessels moved in patterns that defied conventional military logic, turning the enemy's own weapons against them. The battle for the capital system was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Vorthak threw everything they had at the approaching human fleet, using weapons that had been banned by galactic convention and tactics that bordered on suicide. Orbital platforms fired continuously until their power cores overloaded. Suicide. Ships launched themselves at human vessels with no regard for their own survival. None of it mattered. The humans had learned from every previous encounter with Vorthak forces, and their tactics had evolved beyond anything the enemy could counter. The fleet moved like a living organism, individual ships coordinating their actions with perfect precision. When one vessel was damaged, others moved to cover its withdrawal. When a breakthrough was achieved, the entire formation flowed through the gap like water through a crack. The breakthrough came when Captain Rodriguez's strike force penetrated the orbital defense network and began targeting the command stations that coordinated the system's defenses. The Vorthak had built their defensive strategy around centralized control, never imagining that an enemy could reach the nerve centers of their network. The humans had learned to strike at the brain rather than waste time fighting the limbs. The final assault on the capital world began as human landing forces breached the atmosphere under cover of orbital bombardment. General Marcus Cole led the Marines as they established beachheads across the planet's surface, their drop pods falling like metal rain through the burning sky. The Vorthok ground forces fought with the desperation of a cornered predator, but they were facing an enemy that had been forged in the crucible of righteous fury. The battle for the Imperial Palace was a symphony of destruction that echoed across the capital city. Human forces advanced through streets lined with the monuments of Vorthok conquest, each statue and memorial representing another species that had fallen to the Empire's brutality. The Marines moved with purpose, remembering the faces of the children who had died at Haven's Rest as they cleared each building and secured each intersection. High Admiral Krex made his final stand in the throne room where generations of Vorthok emperors had planned their campaigns of conquest. The chamber was filled with trophies taken from defeated worlds, artifacts stolen from extinct civilizations, and weapons that had been used to commit genocide across the galaxy. The human soldiers who breached the doors saw not just the enemy's leader, but a symbol of everything they had sworn to destroy. The trial that followed was broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. Representatives from dozens of species came to witness the proceedings as the evidence of Vorthok war crimes was presented to the Galactic Court. The recordings from Haven's Rest were played in their entirety, showing the systematic murder of innocent civilians and the deliberate targeting of non-combatants. The judges listened in horror as survivor after survivor testified about the atrocities they had witnessed. Dr. Emily Watson presented the psychological profile of the Vorthok species that her team had compiled during the war. The evidence showed that the Empire's leadership had ordered the Haven's Rest massacre not out of military necessity, but as a deliberate act of terrorism designed to intimidate other species into submission. The attack had been planned and executed with the specific intention of maximizing civilian casualties. The verdict was unanimous. The surviving Vorthok leadership was found guilty of genocide, crimes against humanity, and violations of every principle of civilized warfare. The sentences were carried out immediately. Broadcasts lived to ensure that every species in the galaxy understood the consequences of targeting innocent civilians. The message was clear: humanity would not tolerate. The murder of innocents and justice would be absolute. The dismantling of the Vorthok Empire took months to complete. Human forces worked with representatives from the liberated species to establish new governments and rebuild the worlds that had been devastated by Vorthok rule. The process was difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it was driven by the same sense of justice that had motivated the war itself. Admiral Stone addressed the galaxy from the ruins of the Vorthok Imperial Palace. Her words were transmitted to every inhabited world, carrying a message that would reshape the balance of power among the stars. Humanity had demonstrated that they possessed both the capability and the will to enforce justice throughout the galaxy. Any species that chose to follow the Vorthok example would face the same fate. The memorial gardens on Haven's Rest were rebuilt using soil from every world that had been liberated from Vorthok rule. The crystal formations that had once powered the colony were restored to their natural beauty, and the sacred groves of the Lumari were replanted with seeds that had been preserved in the colony's archives. The new memorial bore the names of every human and Lumari who had died in the massacre, along with a simple inscription that served as both promise and warning. Children from across human space came to visit the memorial, learning about the events that had transformed their civilization from peaceful explorers into galactic guardians. They stood in the gardens where Tommy Brooks and his friend Vel had once played, understanding that the price of peace was eternal vigilance against those who would harm the innocent. The Vorthok Empire was gone, but its legacy lived on in the changed nature of human civilization. The species that had once been known for their curiosity and cooperation had proven that they could be just as effective at war when circumstances demanded it. The galaxy had learned that humanity was not to be underestimated, and that the murder of innocents would always be met with swift and terrible justice. The songs of the Lumari were silent forever, but their memory lived on in the hearts of the humans who had loved them. The crystal formations of Haven's Rest glowed with peaceful energy once again, powering a civilization that had learned the true cost of freedom. The stars themselves seemed brighter, as if the universe approved of the justice that had been served. In the deepest archives of the former Vorthek capital, human researchers discovered the complete records of the Empire's crimes against sentient life. The documentation of atrocities committed across dozens of worlds provided evidence for additional trials and reparations. The galaxy would never forget the lessons learned from humanity's response to the Haven's Rest massacre. The transformation was complete. Humanity had evolved from innocent explorers into the galaxy's guardians of justice, and they would never again allow evil to flourish unchallenged. The memory of Haven's Rest would burn forever in their collective consciousness, a reminder that some crimes could never be forgiven and some enemies could never be allowed to survive. The reckoning was over, but the promise remained. Any species that chose to target innocent civilians would face the full fury of humanity's wrath, and justice would be as inevitable as the turning of the stars themselves.